Hello, you are listening to Split the Difference. Today we are joined by Martin Seager, a consultant clinical psychologist with over 30 years' experience working in the NHS. Martin is co-editor of the Handbook of Male Psychology and Mental Health, along with John Barry and Roger Kingley. He's also co-founder of the Male Psychology Network. Hello Martin, thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about you and your career, please?
I'm a clinical psychologist, but I'm 61 years old now. So I started in psychology in 1980. I changed subjects and I found psychology very interesting. So I volunteered in mental health, Samaritans and things like that. So I got my degree in experimental psychology. Then I was a musician, so I was playing in a band for a year. Then I went into clinical psychology, into the National Health Service for 30 years. And became sort of a head of service eventually, and into lecturing, researching. I got into broadcasting a bit with the BBC. In terms of male psychology, my interest, I've carried on being a psychologist and a therapist. I still practice.
So it seems that you've had quite a varied, long-standing career. Is the work with the men and boys something that has grown throughout that period, or is it new since you've retired?
It wasn't till I was in my 40s that I suddenly thought, yeah, men have a gender too. What's that? I didn't really think men had a gender. You've just got gender issues with women, just like ethnic issues with people who weren't white, and white people don't have an ethnicity, which is stupid. So all these things were about, I had to flip a lot of things in my head. And when you do that and you start publishing and writing, you get a lot of resistance. I was asked to write books on men by a number of publishers. As soon as I started saying what I wanted to say, they didn't want to publish it.
Wow, so okay then. So out of the research and all the work that you've done, what would you say is the most interesting thing, and what's the output for you? What's the end result for you?
What we've come up with, scientifically so far is kind of summarized in a theory we're calling gamma bias at the moment. So what all gamma bias is really saying is it's called a gender distortion matrix, which is only 4 boxes. You can do something good, you can do something bad, you can receive something good or receive something bad. So the do good box we call celebration, the do bad box we call perpetration, the receive good bad we call privilege, and the receive good is privilege, the receive bad is victimhood. So if you go into each box, if you do something good, gender is highlighted if you're female and played down if you're male. If you do something bad, gender is highlighted if you're male and played down if you're female. If you receive something good, gender is highlighted if you're male and played down if you're female. And if you receive something bad, gender is highlighted if you're female and played down if you're male. So that's the theory. When you start saying this stuff, people think you're against women. It's like I say to people, well, if I was working with children, does it mean I hate old people? It's just stupid, It's all part of the human condition. And our whole approach is to be inclusive. This is the science that we're trying to come up with. We're trying to put a framework around it which would help researchers. We're putting it out as a theory. We're not putting it out as an ideology. It's not men's rights. It's just science. One of our speakers at our last conference, Tanya Reynolds from the US, she looked at moral typecasting. She goes through all these scenarios and does surveys and research. And John did this and Jane did that. How bad are they? And you get people, massive sample of people to rate people morally according to. So for the same action, men are blamed more than women. And therefore, our punishment of men is higher, prison sentencing. When women are violent, we tend to look for explanations. They were damaged, they were this. But when men are violent, we blame them we don't make any explanation, we don't look to explain why. And a lot of the most damaged men in our prisons were abused by their mothers. There's a lot of evidence of that.
Okay, so given that we know there's not as many services in the community for young men and boys, how do you think this is affecting them?
If you're a young boy now, you're hearing all sorts of contradictory messages which amount to a double bind. You should be vulnerable, but you're bad, you're toxic, but you've got to be vulnerable. There's all this sort of language, and it's very, very hard it's a paradox, because on the one hand, as you said, we're telling men to open up and blaming them for not coming forward, but we're slagging them off as awful people. And then we're saying, why don't you come for help? It becomes a way of making boys feel ashamed. And of course, on the archetypes of masculinity, shame is the big one. If you feel ashamed, you're more likely to do something unpleasant to yourself or someone else. So if we're shaming boys and then blaming them when they get upset or they don't do well at school, as you say, underperform, boys are now 20% less, there's 20% less boys than girls going through to university. That's a huge gap, but it's not a gap we're even interested in, because our lens is completely focused on protecting and lifting the inequalities of women based on this whole culture.
How does it feel to be attempting to bring men into the spotlight in and around equality? How does it feel to be who you are and try to do what you're doing?
It feels like a massive struggle. It feels like you're forever having to fend off being seen as stupid. I mean, I'm a highly intelligent, highly moral person, but I'm forever having to keep going despite being treated as if I'm stupid, as if I'm some kind of corrupt, someone who's in some ways trying to assert privilege rather than just create equality. You make progress, but very slowly. It's like you're fighting a tide. So that's the main feeling, that you're walking against a tide of, I suppose, like anyone who's suffering prejudice, you're disqualified. That's how it feels like. Even when you produce hard evidence, you're disqualified.
It all sounds like it's very difficult to attempt to first have all this education, this research, all of this knowledge. And then secondly, as a man, you're trying to push something forward that you're kind of on the front line, I guess, to some degree. So how does that feel like? I mean, do you ever feel like giving up?
But I, like yourself, I wouldn't give up, and I'm determined. And it's not gender isn't my only thing. I love the human race and I love psychological aspects of it. My interests are in humanity. I believe that masculinity is part of humanity, and humanity needs it. And obviously bad men exist and do bad things, but they're not bad because they're men. They're bad because they're damaged people who happen to be male, therefore they're going to behave differently from damaged women. Although, as we know from domestic abuse, not quite as differently as we thought.
I see. Martin, I think it's safe to say that you qualify as an expert. You're duly trained, 30 years experience, you've worked to climb to the top of your ladder, you've contributed to the profession outside of your role, and of course you've been involved in experimental work. The community doesn't have your knowledge, obviously, and your experience. It doesn't understand what you understand. And I'm wondering what can be said about that and how maybe people can make it a little bit easier for men to actually have their voice.
Just that boys and men are every bit as human as women and girls, and they show their humanity in different ways. They have a different emotional language, but a different language isn't what we're trying to do now is make men and boys communicate in a less, instead of listening to men and boys in their own language, we're trying to make them speak a different language. And if you did that with any other group, an ethnic group, say, well, you've got to start speaking this language. We're not going to try and tune into your language. So I think my main feeling is we need to tune into the language of men and boys. And that includes their behavior, not just their words, because men show their feelings in many ways. They show their feelings by playing rock, blues music is mainly written by men. Men have a lot of feelings. Most artists and composers, music, they're men showing their feelings. Men do show their feelings. That's probably what I would say. All we've got to do is start listening. I hope that there'll be a rebalance, because it's like an orchestra. If you tune out the guitars or the violins and put up the brass, we're not going to have proper music. To have music, everything must be in harmony and balance, and masculinity and femininity have to both have their place in the orchestra for it to sound like proper music.
Martin, I'd like to thank you for participating in this interview and spending the time to tell us what gamma bias is and the difficulties there are in society today for men and boys. Hopefully some of the knowledge that you've shared will help others to think about who they are and how they can present themselves to men, and also how they can listen. Thank you very much.